So here we are, this is the 413th, having had what did we do? We got up to 552 with sub-predictions, and then we had extensions to them, which I think we had about 70 of those. So I lose track, we must have done more than 700 of these. But this is the 413th main prediction. So we're now going for the second fire sign on the 1 NC Pentecost, 2020 Sivan 7, or the 7th Sabbath of it, which is the Sivan 6. And we're going for the third fire sign on Sivan 21, which is the 8th 2 NC Pentecost. So it's quite cute really. Second fire sign starts World War III. There are 14 times of revelation of the count of the ride of the horseman, the red horseman, the war horseman of Revelation, the second horseman of Revelation 6, up until him having this big sword, long sword, which is a weapon of mass destruction, which releases that. That begins the Great Tribulation, which is the nuclear part of World War III, lasting 24 days, day for an elder of Revelation 7:12, whereas World War III lasts for 42 days, a day for a bare tooth of Daniel 7:5. But from the start of the World War III to the start of the Great Tribulation is 14 days of the sentence count of the ride of the second horseman, who is war. And there's 14 days between Sivan 7 and Sivan 21. So the second fire sign is the 1 NC Pentecost, third fire sign is the 2 NC Pentecost. And now, after nearly 14 years, actually more than 14 years, just over 14 years of not understanding 1 Kings 18, I once again believe I do understand it. So here's how it works. The fire signs do occur at Super Pentecosts, but I hadn't quite got the definition of a Super Pentecost right. It's the Leviticus 23 verse 15 and verse 16 definition of a Pentecost. But in verse 15, where it says Sabbath, instead of taking it as a weekly Sabbath, you take it as a Pentecost festival Sabbath. So what it says is you count 7 Pentecosts festivals, Sabbaths, after your 0th Sabbath, actually from the first fruits after your 0th Sabbath. And they should be complete, says verse 15. And verse 16 says you count to the day after the 7th Sabbath, 50 days. In that verse you take the Sabbath to be the weekly Sabbath of the 7th Pentecost of verse 15. So what that actually means is you basically just go 7 Pentecosts further than your 0th Pentecost, and then the final Pentecost, the 7th, is in fact the 50 count of verse 16. So it's a Pentecost which is a Pentecost within a Pentecost, and that's why it's a Super Pentecost. It's a daily, weekly Sabbath Pentecost within a festival Sabbath Pentecost. Now what it says in Elijah, what he said, what his attendants said, what the narrator said in 1 Kings 18 verse 43. He said, and it came about on the 7th. Elijah tells his attendant, go up the mountain, go back 7 times. Oh, incidentally, go to the top. Elijah went to the top of the mountain, the word being Rosh, like Rosh Hashanah, which can mean new, start, top, head. I thought that ambiguity, I thought there might be an interpretation where it means start, temporal beginning. But it can't, because Elijah goes up to the top, which would, if it was the temporal beginning, would be the start of, a kingdom, or Zoar, Mount Carmel, meaning garden land. So he goes to the top of Carmel, which should be the top of the garden land, which should be the beginning of the kingdom, or the beginning of Zoar. And he does that, and then he asks his attendant, he says to him, go up. But if it was temporal, he already would have gone up, because the two do it at the same time, because they're both in the same time frame. So it's not temporal. So it does actually mean top of the administration. And what that means is it makes it much simpler. Elijah going up the top of a mountain is either actually Laodicea being installed, or me being installed over an administration over a church. And that always happens at a Pentecost. And that's the 0th Pentecost. Because then, either on that day or shortly afterwards, I say, well, go and have a look, see if you can see a fire sign, and there isn't one. And there's the no-show. And then you do 7 more Pentecosts after that, which takes you 7 years forward, precisely. Actually, not precisely, but to the Pentecost, And then you can go to any version of the seventh Pentecost, as late as there is a version. And there is a version if there is an instalment or a celebration of the first fruits. And the problem with the issue is that the first 2NC marriage is actually Sivan 2, and the second 2NC marriage is Tammuz 2. And they're both on 2NC first fruits. And Tammuz 2 is the 9th 2NC Pentecost. It is actually the 10th possibility, but Shabbat 2 wasn't the first fruits because it was during a Sabbath month. You can't have a Pentecost or a first fruits on a Sabbath month. A Sabbath month is a release from sacred works, and even though festivals are good fun and they're hardly work, they are nonetheless prescribed duty of worship from Jehovah, and therefore they are sacred work, which is fun actually if you get it right. And you don't do that on a Sabbath. You can't commit false worship on a Sabbath. Well, you can. You don't get punished for it. You get punished if you... Well, the false worship you can commit on a Sabbath is to break the Sabbath. That's what matters on the Sabbath. So, I've probably confused you all now, but to recap, a Super Pentecost is an installation over a church, and you go 7 more Pentecosts after that. It can be 7 years, or it can be 7 years and a month, or 7 years less a month, or 7 years plus 2 or 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 months, depending on how many instances of the 7th Pentecost there are that are celebrated. But what that means is that the fire sign occurs at a 1NC or 2NC Pentecost. Really, or a Zoar Pentecost actually, except that you don't really go to the top of an administration at a Zoar installation. You only do that when you're appointed over the saints. So really it's a 1NC or 2NC Pentecost. Now the first fire sign occurred at the late 2NC Pentecost 2010, Chislev 21. It ran from Chislev 20, the 7th Sabbath of that Pentecost, to Chislev 23, the day after Chislev 22, which was the weekly Sabbath. And the confusing thing is that Pentecost wasn't really a distinguishing seventh. Right, now I must introduce the concept of a distinguishing seventh. Right, so finally the narrator says that the attendant, he says it came about on the 7th, not on the 7th time of going back, just on the 7th, that the attendant got to say, oh look, there's a small cloud like a man's palm rising from the sea. Now that 7th is not just the 7th day of booths, because the 2NC Pentecost is always the 7th day of booths. It has to be a distinguishing 7th, a 7th that isn't normally the case. Likewise, it can't be the 7th Pentecost, because we know we've gone back to the 7th Pentecost. Also, it can't be just a 7th month or a 7th year, because it applies to the fire signs. The fire sign itself must be a 7th, and it doesn't last a month or a year. So you're looking for a 7th, because, okay, you're going forward 7 Pentecosts, right? And that's when the fire sign occurs, on the 7th Pentecost after your installation. Very straightforward. But you don't know which incidents of that Pentecost, and there can be a lot of incidences. And to find out which incidents, it's the first one that falls on a distinguishing Sabbath, I wish it was. It's the first one where the fire sign occurs both at the Pentecost and at the distinguishing Sabbath, which may or may not be said Pentecost. That encompasses also the first fire sign, where the 7th wasn't Chislev 21, which isn't any form of 7th that I can work out, any distinguishing 7th. The fire sign occurred on Chislev 21, but it was spotted on Chislev 22, which is the weekly Sabbath, which is a distinguishing Sabbath, because Pentecosts never fall on weekly Sabbaths. 1NC Pentecost happened the day after a weekly Sabbath. 2NC Pentecosts happen on the 21st of the month, if that isn't a Sabbath. So they never happen on a weekly Sabbath. So for a fire sign to occur on a weekly Sabbath is a distinguishing thing. But the only reason we got that is the fire sign lasted more than one day. So the long and the short of it is, the second and third fire signs will occur on a 1NC Pentecost or a 2NC Pentecost, or a late version of one or other of those, or on a Sabbath very close to one of those. But we have them occurring now on the Pentecost themselves, or on the 7th Sabbath of the Pentecost, because a Pentecost is a count of 7 Sabbaths as well as a count of to the day after 7 Sabbaths. You actually count 7 Sabbaths, then you count to the day after. There's 2 counts in a Pentecost. So by a Pentecost, it's an ambiguous definition, as they all are, which it could mean 49 days, it could mean 50 days. That's how much of a festival geek you have to be to understand 1 Kings 18, and that, I think, is what the scriptures mean. We've not added to them and we've not taken away from them. You go back 7 times and it comes about on a 7th. That's a distinguishing 7th on the 7th Pentecost, after an installation, which is going up the mountain. You go up the mountain, you get installed. You go back for 7 more Pentecosts after that. So which version of that Pentecost? Is it the regular one, the late one, the doubly late one? Which one is it? Well, it's the one that falls on the 7th, or if the Pentecost itself doesn't fall on the 7th, the fast sign extends over the Pentecost and over a 7th after or before it. And before it, it can be the 7th Sabbath, except that that's not a distinguishing 7th, so it can't be the 7th Sabbath actually. And then after it, it could be a weekly Sabbath, but it can't be a monthly Sabbath or a yearly Sabbath, because you don't get a fast sign lasting that for a month or for a year. So there you go. That's taken me a hell of a long time to work out. 2 Kings 1 is a lot simpler. It says that the chief of the 50 and the 50 were both consumed. Chief of the 50 is the Pentecost, and the 50 is a day in the 50 count. And so we now take the second chief of 50 of 2 Kings 1 to be the Pentecost from ER 2 to Sivan 21, which is the 7th 2NC Pentecost. And Sivan 21 is the chief of that Pentecost, and Sivan 7 is a day during that 50 count. So if there's a fast sign on Sivan 7 and another one on Sivan 21, you satisfied 2 Kings 1. That's more simple to understand. Although, again, 2 Kings 1 says that with the second 50, that Elijah spoke to them by saying, if I am a man of God, let fire come from the heavens and eat up you and your 50. He spoke to the chief of the 50, but in doing that was speaking to them. So that's saying that the chief is inclusive, not exclusive. So the chief actually is the Pentecost, not the late Pentecost in that case. Alright, so there's 2 Kings 1 and there's 1 Kings 18. Now, a couple of cute things. Firstly, we now understand what went on, we think, on 2019 AB 14, and therefore, by the mirror, what will go on 2020 AB 14. What happened on that day was that Laodicea experienced a reverse Passover. The Passover that occurred on 33 Nisan 14 was the end of the law of Moses. It's when the law of Moses became a false religion. It was nailed to the stake by Caiaphas and the Romans. And that was the final sacrifice, Jesus Christ. Now, you didn't need any more sacrifices after that. And all sacrifices pointed to that. And that was the end of the sacrificial phase of mankind's salvation. So that ended the law. But on AB 14 2019, what happened was Laodicea, which was a false church, didn't become a true church because it wasn't appointed until first fruits, AB 21. But its form of worship became accepted. In other words, it regained its constant feature. In other words, it became a true worshipping group that was unappointed. It got its constant feature back. In other words, rather than going from true worship to false worship, they went from false worship to true worship on that day. And so God accepted the Passover celebration that Laodicea did on AB 14. And the third presence began on AB 10 with Russell, descended Charles Russell, who's the third Elijah, baptizing a 1NC, two of them actually, to make the third presence begin, so that Jesus is there when two are gathered in his name. And that was the Passover entry day, but it wasn't an execution Passover on AB 14. So I don't think they were entered into that Passover on that day. Nonetheless, that's when they were baptized. Maybe they were. Well, maybe they were entered into the form of Passover that Laodicea actually experienced, which was a reverse Passover, where its constant feature became accepted. So just as when a church becomes false, first of all its constant feature is rejected, and that means it's constructively a false church, and then it's actually totally rejected and becomes a false church after its constant feature is rejected. Likewise, I suppose when a church is reappointed, which doesn't happen that often, it's putting the camel through the eye of a needle, literally that one. A camel being a trading beast, and a false church is a trading beast. So when it becomes a true church again, before it becomes a true church, its worship is re-accepted. So its worship being accepted or rejected precedes the appointment or fall of a true church. Right. Now the rapture, we've got Genesis 40, sorry. The wonderful dream of the cupbearer and the baker. Except it wasn't a dream of the cupbearer and the baker. What the scripture says is the baker and the cupbearer sinned. So the chief of the bakers and the chief of the cupbearers is put in prison. The two officers, eunuchs of Pharaoh. And then it says at the end that the head of the chief of the bakers and the head of the chief of the cupbearers are lifted up. So now you've got baker, you've got chief of baker, you've got head of chief of baker, and you've got eunuch, and you've got cupbearer, you've got chief of cupbearer, you've got head of chief of cupbearer, and you've got eunuch. 4 designations for the same guy in the account, but 4 greater meanings in each case. The bakers are the 1 NCs, the cupbearers are the 2 NCs. The chief of the cupbearers is administration of the 2 NCs in the Odysseus. The chief of the bakers administration of the 1 NCs in FDS 3, possibly also in 1 NC Zoar. The head of the chief of the cupbearers are the sealed 2 NCs who get lifted into the ark. And that isn't actually what the lifting of the head is in their case. And the head of the chief of the bakers is the sealed 1 NCs. And the eunuchs, I'm not quite sure. Eunuchs, that would be people who haven't got any seed, as opposed to Joseph, who somehow manages to get involved in the baptism, turning of water into wine of Benjamin, and therefore has seed. Anyway, the 3 days, the 3 twigs are not 3 days in the original. See, the trouble is, you've got a dream, which has its own interpretation, greater meaning. Then you have the interpretation of that dream in the literal account, which interpretation has its own interpretation in the greater meaning. Then you have the fulfillment of the dream according to the interpretation, which also has a blooming greater meaning. So you've got a lot of greater meanings going on here. And when you work the whole thing out, this is how it works more or less. The 3 twigs are on the vine. The vine is Jesus. 3 twigs are the 1 NC branch of the JAC, 2 NC and the HLCs. Those are the 3 bunches of saints. And they're the 3 bunches of grapes. And they get squeezed into the cup. That's the sealing. So the one presiding over the sealing of all of this is the chief of the cupbearers. We don't get any of these guys until they're sealed, other than a few dozen that we've presently got of 2 NCs in Zoar. So that's the 3 twigs. And then the 3 baskets are 3 days of feeding of 3 churches on the head, on top of the head, over and above the head of the watchtower, which is Laodicea, reappointed Laodicea and 1 NC Zoar, all after the watchtower had done their feeding. So that's the interpretation of the dream in the greater meaning, which isn't the interpretation made by Joseph. But Joseph's interpretation he said there's 3 days. The baskets are 3 days, and the 3 twigs branches are 3 days. And in 3 days' time your heads get lifted up. And the 3 days in the case of the chief of bakers are 3 Passover days, because it's a 1 NC situation, and the Passover is the 1 NC celebration. And those 3 days are Adar, Nisan, Iyar. And then on Iyar, the 3rd day, is Pharaoh's birthday, because that is when the last CRC sealing of a 1 NC occurs at the Passover, when his feet are dried with the towel wrapped around Jesus' loins, ending his water baptism, finishing it, the 3 sea baptism, and then his head is lifted up into the ark on that day. And all the 7th bride of the 1 NCs for the 7th marriage and all the HLCs were ark raptured on that day. So there's the fulfillment. It's 3 1 NC festivals. Adar 14, 2019, Nisan 14, Iyar 14, 2020. Those are the 3 days of the chief of the bakers. Then the chief of the cupbearers is a 2 NC. So his 3 days are 3 2 NC festivals. The corresponding 2 NC festivals to the 1 NC festivals. So they are Adar 22, Nisan 22, and Iyar 22. And on Iyar 22, what happened was, we made this prediction. Now Iyar 22 is the end of the contest day. Incidentally, okay, We've now extended contest noon to be a month longer, which means the contest day, instead of ending of 1 Kings 18, instead of ending Nisan 22, 2020, ends Zoar 22. And what happens at the end of contest day is Elijah's given the correct prediction, or gets it, or both. And the present prediction for Sivan 6-7 and Sivan 20-21 came on ER 22, mainly because the ER 21 prediction was seen not to have worked. And the head of the chief of the cupbearers is basically the administration of this church, which is the tuft of hair of Ezekiel 8, which is the engaged 2NCs, the ones who've celebrated the 2NC with me, and therefore are my fiancée. And we get raptured into the ark for the first 2NC marriage on Sivan 2, but we get lifted up, not into the ark. You see, lifted up is another ambiguity. In the case of the chief of bakers, it's a rapture into the ark. In the case of the chief of the cupbearers, it isn't a rapture into the ark. It is a getting of the correct prediction, which does lift them up enormously. The reason we can extend noon by a month is this. We know Laodicea was appointed over the 1NC reserves on 2003 Chislev 2, which is the late 2NC, well, it's late 2NC first fruits. So we therefore imagine that they were installed on Tebet 21 2003, which is late 2NC Pentecost. Impossible. That was a Sabbath month. So we thought, all right, they're installed on Shabbat 21. Impossible. That was a Jubilee month. So actually they were installed on Adar 21. So that means is that the 12 years of betrayal goes from 2003 Adar 21, because Judas is one of the 12. There's the betrayal, and there were 12 spies and all the rest of it. They spied on us for 12 years. And that takes you to 2015 Adar 21. And the 40 days of spying must have run from then to Nisan 30, 2016. But the wilderness penalty began Nisan 1 and runs to Tammuz 30, 40 months. And then they got appointed Ab 21, reappointed Laodicea after the wilderness penalty had ended. And noon begins with the wilderness penalty, because you don't shine the light when you've been banished or ostracised into the wilderness. And noon means double lights. So there ceased to be 2 illuminations for the 1NC reserves when the wilderness penalty came into force on Nisan 1. So that's the end of noon, and what that does is that bumps the end of the contest day forward a month to ER 22, which is the third bunch of grapes, the third branch, the third twig of Genesis 40. So that's Genesis 40. And then the rapture of the unengaged 2NCs is Sivan 14. Now Jesus makes a promise to the angel of Philadelphia, who is yours truly, and he said, I will keep you out of the hour of the test. So we get raptured with the tuft of hair of Ezekiel 8. The engaged 2NCs get raptured prior to the hour of the test. And there's no point in Jesus making that promise. He says, I'm doing that because you've showed endurance. It's a very kind critique of this church. Yes, we had endurance, but very little else. We had faith, we obeyed the first law, we had endurance. I was crap with the second law, didn't know what this church was about. It was never about evangelism, it was always about research. This is a research church. Should have made it clear. If I'd had my time again, I could have run this thing properly. And thanks to God, we all get our times again. But I didn't make a good job of it, other than I did endure, and I did stick to the first law, which is what Jesus commends me for. And all my videos are a testament to the endurance. So he keeps me from the test, but by implication he does not keep the rest of the 2NCs from the test, because they didn't endure in the manner that I have. So they go up after the test begins. They actually go up on Sivan 14. The reason we know that is that we've now moved the acceptable year forward. We've bumped that forward as well a month. It begins on Ab 1 and it ends on Tammuz 30, the acceptable year. And that's because we've moved the Zoar year, the new Zoar secular year, forward to Ab 1. I mean, we've had to do it because otherwise you can't fit the baptism in. That's why we did it. But everything works better like that anyway. But I don't quite understand why Zoar has an Ab 1 secular year. I mean, we got appointed over the 1NCs on AB 5 2013. That wouldn't make a secular year. Or maybe it does, which is a secular year. It's really weird. When Jehovah became Caesar to Israel in the days of Moses, that changed the year, the sacred year, to be Nisan. Well, the year start to be a Nisan year start, which was a sacred year. It's really weird. Him becoming a Caesar altered the sacred year. And it appears that when you become a sacred king, it therefore alters the secular year. How weird. There's something I don't understand. But likewise, when Jesus became Caesar in 2020 11 to all the non-Adamics, he made a new sacred year, ER1. So him becoming a secular king makes this new sacred year. This I don't understand, but it seems to be the pattern. So actually that would fit. So us becoming a sacred king on our 5, which I suppose is Jesus becoming a sacred king because we're his vassal, would change the secular year. Don't understand it. Anyway, that being the case, the end of the Pharisee water baptism is the end of the acceptable year, which is Thames 30, and there's a 40-day deluge of Genesis 7:17 prior to that. So that would run from Sivan 21, the third fire sign, the beginning of the Great Tribulation, to Thames 30. And then we know that that deluge starts 7 days after the last saint enters into the ark. So the last saint enters into the ark 7 days prior to Sivan 21, which is Sivan 14. And it's very appropriate that Sivan 14, because John 10 does say that the Jews encircled Jesus at the festival of the dedication, which was all the watchtower Passovers, and said, "Until when are you lifting the soul of us up?" So basically they get lifted up at a many-versary of the 14th of the month. In other words, they get lifted up on the 14th of the month. And everybody seems to go up on the 14th, unless it's to a marriage, in which case they go up on the day of the marriage. And I'm not even sure that's true. I don't actually know whether the 3rd, 4th and 5th bride and the 6th and 7th bride certainly went up on the Passover for a marriage at first fruits. I don't know what happened with the 3rd, 4th and 5th. They may have actually also gone up on the Passover for a marriage at first fruits. We may be the only bride that doesn't go up at the Passover, and that's because I had to finish the contest before we were allowed up. I mean, I got upset with Jesus because we were never invited to any of the 1NC marriages in circumstances where we did a lot of work on how the Passover, the engagement festival for that marriage, should be held. But actually, I don't think he could have invited me because I hadn't finished the contest. Had I worked out the correct date for the contest earlier, I could have gone to one of those marriages. But I was never going to do that because the contest day does end on the hour 22, which is the last day of the 7th marriage feast. So there you go. Anyway, I'm not sure. We presently have the 3rd and 4th and 5th bride going up on the first fruits on Tishri 17, Heshvan 22 and Chislev 20, and that may be correct. Or they may have gone up at the Passover. I don't really know. But without a doubt, rapture days for saints are either the Passover, because a rapture is a Passover from the dragon being your secular king, your Caesar, to Jesus being your secular king, your Caesar in the ark. And so you go up on the Passover day or you go up on the marriage day, one or the other. And if you're not married, so if you're unengaged, you will go up on the Passover day. So that's when the unengaged 2NCs go up on Sivan 14. But if you are married, perhaps you go up at first fruits. That seems to be the case, although the 6th and 7th brides didn't do that, because Esther 14 has the rest on the 14th day and the 15th day. 15th day being the first day of booths, so that is a Sabbath, but the 14th day is not a festival Sabbath. So that rest was in the ark, not a festival. Again, that's the ambiguity of the scripture. There are two types of rest in the same use, it's a Gnostic interpretation, in the same chapter, Esther 9. So those are most of the goodies we've come up with recently. Sorry it's so technical, but what's happened is the world has fallen behind and sold short the brilliance of God's book, and so they're a long way behind my understanding, and my understanding isn't anywhere near the perfection of that book. We've all sold the book short. But the good news is that with the gifts of the Spirit, the that true knowledge will become abundant very shortly. I should just give the Gregorian dates. So Sivan 6/7, the second fire sign, is May 29 to 31. And Sivan 2021, the third fire sign, which begins the Great Tribulation, is June 12 to 14. Now we have the second fire sign occurring in America and the third in Britain, but maybe the wrong way around. Now it's probably more likely that World War III would begin with an attack on America than it would on Britain. So maybe the Great Tribulation begins with an attack on Britain, which would be nuclear. The trouble is that the Great Tribulation one will be nuclear. So the third fire sign is nuclear, the second fire sign is not. So we don't really know which one is on Britain and which one is on America. But either Britain or America will be attacked on May 29 to 31. And then the other one will be attacked in a nuclear way on June 12 to 14. And then 24 days after that is the end of all nuclear war. And 4 days more after that, on Thames 1718, that is the end of all war that John Lennon foresaw. That will be the last day of war, because war is already obsolete. Our offensive weapons are far too capable and our defensive weapons cannot stop them. So war is completely futile. It's just an exercise in self-annihilation. Everybody who starts a war today is in fact a suicide bomber. Or anybody who actually gets involved in a war in circumstances where there are other avenues to resolve the problem is a suicide bomber. Thank you.